Today, I'm going to be interviewing Richard Rogers. Richard is a qualified lawyer in California, England, and Wales. He was the OSCE's Chief Legal System Monitor in post-conflict Kosovo prior to the independence referendum and declaration, and he has assisted the development of criminal justice systems in several newly independent states, including Bosnia, Herzegovina, and Croatia. Richard has represented several peoples seeking secession who have been victims of persecution or mass crimes at the hands of their parent state, including the National Movement for the Liberation of Azawad in Mali and the Transitional Government of Tamil Eelam in Sri Lanka. He was the principal defender at the ECCC and the head of legal support for the appeals chamber at the United Nations International Criminal Tribunal for former Yugoslavia. Richard has testified before the United States Congress House Committee on Foreign Affairs and spoken to human rights issues before the EU Parliament and the Parliament of Bosnia and Herzegovina. He's an expert for the World Bank Inspection Panel and the UK Stabilization Unit. Today, we're going to discuss the Sikhs' right for self-determination and also how Referendum 2020 plays into it. Hi, Richard. Thank you so much for being here with me today. Richard Rogers is an international lawyer who's representing the Referendum 2020 campaign. And today we're going to talk about the right for self-determination, and we're also going to talk about how Referendum 2020 ties into it. Now, to start off, Richard, can you please give us a brief introduction on the right to self-determination and how it is in terms of international law?
Yeah, under international law, all peoples have the right to self-determination. And that means that they have a right to freely determine their political status and to freely pursue their economic, social and cultural development. And that right is contained in some fundamental UN documents, including the UN Charter, which set up the United Nations, and it's Article 1 of that charter. And since that, it's been contained in many fundamental human rights treaties, including the Bill of Rights.
So who has this right to self-determination, and what are the qualifications for it?
Well, it belongs to peoples, and that's defined as a group of individuals who have common characteristics. So that would include a racial group, an ethnic group, a religious group, a cultural group. And there's no doubt that the Sikhs fall under the definition of peoples. But I think it's important to note that it doesn't mean that groups can simply break away from their parent state. Under international law, there's a presumption of territorial integrity, and the rule is that peoples should pursue self-determination from within the parent state. But there are exceptions to that rule. There are three exceptions that are recognized by international law, and one of them is where people are colonized. The second is where people are occupied by a foreign power and subjugated. And the third is where peoples within a state have tried to obtain self-determination, but it's been blocked by the parent state. So the only choice that they have is secession and independence.
So in terms of the Sikhs, what would the main arguments be for them for their right for self-determination?
Well, firstly, the Sikhs are a people, so they do have the right. So the real question is whether or not they fall within the exceptions to the rule, meaning are they within one of the categories who are allowed to secede? And there's a good arguable case that the Sikhs fall within two of the three categories. Firstly, there's an argument that they are an occupied state and subjugated, and that is because there was an independent Sikh state prior to the East India Company conquering them. That lasted from at least 1799 to 1849. And then once it was conquered, it was handed over to the British Raj, and then it was assumed within India on independence and partition. So there's an argument to be made that Sikh state should have its original status back, which would be an independent state. There's a second argument that the Sikhs could make, which is that even if they're not an occupied state, then they are a peoples, and they have tried to pursue their economic, social and cultural development within India but it's been consistently blocked for decades. And it's been blocked in several ways. When they wanted their religion recognised in the constitution, it was denied. When they wanted greater impact for their language, it's been denied. When they wanted to maintain their waterways, they were diverted. And so time and time again, we've seen any efforts to create a little bit more autonomy or to pursue their cultural, economic development within India, we've seen it blocked. And of course, the worst examples of that were in 1984, when there were massive atrocities committed against the Sikhs by the Indian state actors. Firstly, in June 1984, when hundreds and possibly thousands of Sikhs were murdered. And then again, later in that year, in November 1984, when thousands and thousands were murdered across the country. And those were terrible events that reflect, to some extent, the attitude of the Indian government to the Sikhs within their own country.
So we are actually hearing Sikhs for Justice is campaigning for this referendum 2020. Now, how is the right for self-determination connected with a referendum?
Well, there's several aspects to any secessionist movement. One is the legality, which I've just explained. Another one is the political reality, and that has to do with India's attitude and the attitude of other nations that may or may not support the Sikhs. But the third one is to have a democratic footing for any campaign or any movement. And the referendum is essential for gauging whether or not Sikhs would like to secede from India, whether or not they feel like there is no possibility of obtaining their economic, social, cultural development within India because of the history, and therefore that they have no choice but to secede. And that's the first crucial step, really, for a secessionist campaign or movement.
So we're hearing that the Sikh community is going for a non-binding referendum in the year 2020. Now, what would the legality of that be under international law?
Well, it's absolutely lawful, and we know that because the International Court of Justice, which is the highest court, has assessed this very question. When Kosovo declared independence from Serbia, Kosovo is a province within the state of Serbia, these Serbs objected to that, and they asked the International Court of Justice to give their opinion about the legality of that unilateral declaration. And the International Court of Justice said that the declaration is absolutely lawful. There is no international law that says that peoples should not hold referendums or should not make declarations of independence, even if the parent state doesn't like it. So we know that the process is legal. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that the secession in itself would be legal, but it does mean that the referendum is legal, and it does mean, or it would mean, that a declaration of independence would be legal. But not only that, it's also very sensible because it's not only is it the first step for a campaign for secession, the first important step, but also, presuming there's a vote in favour of secession, it would also empower that movement because in the past, India have labelled the secessionists as terrorists. They have not recognised the right to self-determination externally as a democratic process. They have become incredibly defensive. And if there was a vote in favour of secession by the majority of Sikh people, then the Indian government wouldn't be able to simply label them all as terrorists. They would have to recognise that process as democratic, as pluralistic, and they would have to eventually sit down with the Sikhs and start discussing in a mature way how they can ensure their self-determination, if not internally, then externally.
Right. So, I mean, in the recent past, has any community successfully achieved the self-determination and sovereignty through a referendum?
Since 1990, there's been about 35 new states. Many of them were products after the Soviet Union broke down in 1989. They were reformed or went back to their original state before they were taken over by the Soviet Union. There were another 5 or 6 states created after the former Yugoslavia broke up. But there have been other examples. For example, South Sudan had a referendum and then gained its independence. Kosovo has gained its independence. East Timor had a referendum and eventually gained its independence. Eritrea, another example. Montenegro, another example. So a referendum is one part of the process, but it may be an extended process. No one's expecting these movements to happen overnight.
So recently we've been hearing about Kurdistan and Catalonia holding one-sided non-binding referendums. Now, in your experience, would these referendums help them in achieving their own goal for this right for self-determination?
Yes, absolutely. I think now we see, for example, with Scotland and Catalonia, that it's very much on the agenda. The Scottish voted in a referendum to remain within the UK. But I think with Brexit, the Scots might understandably change their mind if there was another referendum. And if they did have another referendum and vote to separate from the United Kingdom, then they would become an independent state because the UK have recognised the Scottish people's right to external self-determination if they want it. Catalonia is a little bit more of a spiky situation. The Spanish resisted very much the Catalonians' referendum, but there's been a change of government since, and now that issue is very much on the forefront of the agenda for the Spanish. So I think it's important, a referendum is important to put the issue on the agenda and to help push forward some mature discussions between the parent state and the peoples concerned.
Well, recently Sikhs for Justice has definitely been making headlines with their Referendum 2020 campaign by holding this London Declaration event that will be happening on August 12th in Trafalgar Square. Will we be hearing from you then?
Yes, I've been invited to speak at the event along with a couple of other human rights lawyers, and I think it's important to as an outreach event to explain to the constituents, to the Sikhs, what this is all about, what the benefits might be, and indeed what the limitations might be as well.
Okay. All right. Well, that's wonderful. We're looking forward to hearing from you then as well. Well, thank you so much, Richard. Thank you.